It was one of those nights when the rain just wouldn't stop. The windshield wipers of David's ambulance were working overtime as he drove home after what felt like the longest shift of his life. 14 hours straight at the hospital, dealing with everything from broken bones to heart attacks. All he wanted was to get home, take a hot shower, and maybe catch a few minutes with his family before falling into bed. David had been a paramedic for almost 10 years now. He'd seen it all, or at least he thought he had. Car accidents, medical emergencies, people at their worst moments and sometimes at their best. But nothing could have prepared him for what was about to happen on that dark stretch of highway. The coastal road was tricky on good days, with its sharp curves and steep drops down to the ocean. On a night like this, with rain coming down like bullets and fog rolling in from the sea, it was downright dangerous. David kept his speed low and his eyes focused on the road ahead. He'd responded to too many accidents on this very stretch of highway. That's when he saw the headlights coming toward him, weaving slightly. At first, he thought maybe it was just someone driving carefully in the bad weather. But then the lights swerved hard to the left, crossing right over the yellow center. And time seemed to slow down as David watched in horror. A delivery truck was coming the other way, and there was nowhere for either vehicle to go. The sound of the crash was something David would never forget. Metal against metal, glass shattering, and then an awful silence that was somehow worse than the noise. David pulled over immediately and grabbed his emergency kit from the back of his truck. His hands were shaking as he dialed for help, but his training kicked in. He'd done this 1,000 times before, just never when he wasn't officially on duty. The delivery truck had rolled onto its side, but David could hear the driver moving around inside, cursing and calling for help. That was a good sign. The small car, though, was completely crushed. The front end was pushed back almost to the windshield, and steam was rising from what was left of the engine. David approached the car carefully. The driver's side door was jammed shut, twisted beyond recognition. He had to climb around to the passenger side using his flashlight to see through the spider-webbed glass. What he saw inside made his heart sink. A young woman was trapped behind the steering wheel. She was conscious, which was surprising given how bad the crash looked, but David could tell immediately that she was hurt badly. Blood was trickling from a cut on her forehead, and from the way she was breathing, he suspected internal injuries. But that wasn't what made David's breath catch in his throat. The woman was clearly pregnant, very pregnant. Her belly was pressed against the steering wheel, and David could only hope that the baby inside was somehow protected from the worst of the impact. Getting the door open took every bit of strength David had. The metal groaned and protested, but finally gave way with a loud crack. The woman's eyes found his immediately, and he was struck by how alert she seemed despite everything that had happened. She tried to speak, but only managed a whisper. David leaned in closer, straining to hear her over the sound of the rain and the approaching sirens. "My baby," she gasped, one hand moving protectively to her stomach. "Please, you have to save my baby." David's training told him to keep her calm, to not make promises he couldn't keep. But looking into her eyes, seeing the pure desperation there, he found himself nodding. "We're going to take care of both of you," he said firmly. "Help is almost here." But even as he said it, David could see that time was running out. The woman's breathing was becoming more labored, and her skin was growing pale. He'd seen enough trauma to know the signs. She was bleeding internally, probably badly. The woman seemed to understand too. With effort that must have cost her everything, she reached out and grabbed David's wrist. Her grip was surprisingly strong for someone in her condition. "Listen to me," she whispered urgently. "If something happens to me, promise me you'll make sure my baby lives. Promise me." David looked into her eyes and saw something that broke his heart. This wasn't just fear or pain talking. This was a mother's love, pure and desperate, and willing to sacrifice everything for her child. In that moment, David knew that this woman had already accepted that she might not survive this night. All that mattered to her was the life she carried. "I promise," David heard himself saying. The words came out before he could think about what they meant, what he was committing to. But once they were out there, hanging in the air between them, he knew he meant them completely. The ambulance arrived just then, followed closely by the fire department. David's colleagues took over, working with practiced efficiency to stabilize the woman and prepare her for transport. But even as they worked around him, David couldn't shake the feeling that his life had just changed in some fundamental way. As they loaded the woman into the ambulance, she caught David's eye one more time. She mouthed the word, "promise," at him, and David nodded. He watched the ambulance disappear into the night, its red lights fading into the rain and fog. Standing there on the side of the highway, David realized that he'd just made the most important promise of his life to a complete stranger. He didn't even know her name, but somehow that didn't matter. What mattered was that somewhere in that ambulance racing through the night was a woman fighting for her life and the life of her unborn child. And David had given his word that he would make sure that baby survived, no matter what it took. The ambulance ride to the hospital felt like the longest 20 minutes of David's life. He sat in the back, watching the medical team work on the woman while trying to keep his own hands steady. Her name was Lisa, he'd learned from her driver's license. Lisa Thompson, 28 years old, living just 2 towns over from where the accident happened. Every few seconds, David found himself checking the monitors that showed her vital signs. The numbers weren't good, and they were getting worse. Her blood pressure was dropping and her heart rate was all over the place. But somehow, incredibly, they could still hear the baby's heartbeat on the special monitor they'd attached to her belly. Lisa drifted in and out of consciousness during the ride. When she was awake, her eyes would find David's, and he could see the question there without her having to ask it. He would nod and squeeze her hand gently, reminding her of his promise without words. The hospital was ready for them when they arrived. David had called ahead, and Dr. Rodriguez, the head of the maternity ward, was waiting with her entire team. They'd cleared an operating room and had specialists standing by. Everyone knew this was going to be touch and go. As they wheeled Lisa through the hospital doors, she grabbed David's arm with surprising strength. "Wait," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the noise of the medical equipment and rushing feet. David leaned down close to hear her. The medical team kept moving, but they gave them this moment. "If something happens to me," Lisa said, each word taking enormous effort, "I need you to know about the baby's father. His name was Michael, Staff Sergeant Michael Torres. He was killed overseas 6 months ago. He never got to know about the baby." David felt his heart breaking all over again. This woman had already lost so much, and now she was fighting for her life and her unborn child's life all alone. "The baby," Lisa continued, tears streaming down her face. "He's all I have left of Michael, and he's all I have left in this world. My parents died in an accident 2 years ago. There's no one else." The weight of what she was telling him hit David like a truck. If Lisa didn't make it, this baby would have no one, no family, no one to take care of him, no one to tell him about his parents or how much he was loved. "I understand," David said, softly, "but you're going to be okay. Both of you are going to be okay." Lisa smiled weakly, but David could see in her eyes that she knew better. She was a teacher, she'd told him during one of her conscious moments in the ambulance. She was smart enough to understand what the doctor's worried looks meant. Smart enough to know that her injuries were too severe. They reached the operating room and the medical team had to separate them. As they prepared Lisa for surgery, Dr. Rodriguez pulled David aside in the hallway. "I need to be straight with you," the doctor said, her voice gentle but serious. "Her injuries are extensive. We're looking at massive internal bleeding possible, damage to major organs. And with the baby being 7 months along, this is incredibly complicated." David felt his stomach drop. "What are you saying?" "We have a choice to make, and we need to make it fast," Dr. Rodriguez explained. "We can try to save Lisa first and hope the baby survives the surgery. Or we can focus on delivering the baby safely, which gives us the best chance to save the child, but makes it much harder to save the mother." The reality of the situation hit David like a physical blow. "What does Lisa want?" "She's asked us to save the baby first," Dr. Rodriguez said quietly. "She's been very clear about that. But I wanted you to know what we're facing." David looked through the small window into the operating room, where Lisa lay surrounded by machines. and medical staff. Even in her condition, even fighting for her life, she was still fighting for her child first. A few minutes later, they let David back into the room. Lisa was more alert now, probably because of the medications they'd given her, but David could see how much pain she was in. "David," she said, reaching for his hand again, "I need to tell you some things about the baby, about what I want for him." For the next few minutes, while the medical team prepared for surgery, Lisa told David everything she could think of. She wanted the baby to know about his father, about how brave Michael had been, and how much he would have loved his son. She wanted him to know that she had dreamed about him every night for months, that she had already picked out his name, James, after her father. She told David about the letters she'd written to the baby, stored in a box in her apartment. Letters about his father, about her hopes for his future, about how much she loved him already. She gave David her apartment key and made him promise to find those letters. "And David," she said, gripping his hand tighter as they prepared to take her into surgery, "if I don't make it through this, please don't let him go to just anyone. He needs someone who will love him, someone who will tell him his story, someone who will make sure he knows that his parents loved him more than anything." The anesthesia mask was lowering over Lisa's face, but she fought to stay conscious just a little longer. "Promise me again," she whispered. "I promise," David said, his voice thick with emotion. "I promise he'll be loved and cared for. I promise he'll know his story." Lisa's eyes closed as the anesthesia took effect, but David could swear he saw a small smile on her face. As they wheeled her into the operating room, David found himself alone in the hallway, holding Lisa's apartment key and carrying the weight of promises that felt bigger than anything he'd ever faced before. The waiting room clock seemed to tick louder than usual as David sat there, staring at the operating room doors. 3 hours had passed since they'd taken Lisa into surgery, and every minute felt like an eternity. He'd called his wife Rachel to let her know he'd be late, but he couldn't bring himself to explain why. How do you tell someone that you've just promised a dying stranger that you'll take care of her baby? Dr. Rodriguez finally emerged from the operating room at 2 in the morning. David could tell from her expression that the news was both good and heartbreaking at the same time. "The baby is alive," she said, sitting down next to David. "He's small, about 4 pounds, but he's breathing on his own and his heart is strong. We got him out just in time." David felt a wave of relief wash over him, followed immediately by dread. "And Lisa?" Dr. Rodriguez shook her head slowly. "We did everything we could. The internal bleeding was too severe, and her body had been through too much trauma. She held on long enough for us to deliver the baby safely, but her injuries were just too extensive." David felt like the air had been knocked out of his lungs. Even though he'd seen it coming, even though Lisa herself had seemed to know what would happen, the reality of it hit him hard. A woman he'd known for only a few hours had died, but not before entrusting him with the most precious thing in her world. She asked about the baby right before she lost consciousness. Dr. Rodriguez continued gently. "I told her he was going to be okay, and she smiled. I think that gave her some peace." David sat in silence for a moment, processing what this meant. Somewhere in this hospital was a newborn baby who would never know his mother, never know his father, and had no family to take care of him. "Can I see him?" David asked. The neonatal intensive care unit was unlike anything David had ever experienced. It was full of tiny babies in plastic incubators connected to machines that beeped and hummed constantly. Nurses moved quietly between the units, checking on their smallest patients with practiced care. Baby James was in the corner under bright warming lights. He was incredibly small, but David could see immediately that he was a fighter. His little chest rose and fell steadily, and his tiny fists were clenched like he was ready to take on the world. "He's doing remarkably well for everything he's been through," said Nancy, the head nurse. "Babies are tougher than we think sometimes, but he'll need to stay here for at least 6 to 8 weeks until he's strong enough to go home." "What happens then?" David asked, though he was afraid he already knew the answer. "Well, normally the baby would go to family," Nancy explained. "But according to our records, there isn't any family listed. So he'll go into the foster care system until we can find him a permanent home." The thought of baby James going to strangers, of bouncing from home to home without anyone to tell him about his parents or how much he'd been wanted, made David's heart ache. This wasn't what Lisa had asked for. She'd wanted someone who would love James, someone who would make sure he knew his story. Over the next few days, David found himself spending more and more time at the hospital. He'd finish his shifts and then head straight to the NICU to sit with James. The nurses began to recognize him, and eventually Nancy started letting him hold the baby during feeding time. "You know," Nancy said one evening as David fed James a bottle, "I've been doing this for 20 years and I've never seen someone so devoted to a baby that isn't theirs." David looked down at James, who was staring up at him with dark eyes that seemed far too wise for such a tiny person. "I made a promise to his mother," he said simply. David had gone to Lisa's apartment with the key she'd given him. It was a small, neat place filled with baby items she'd been collecting for months. The nursery was painted yellow with little animals on the walls, and there was a rocking chair by the window where Lisa had probably sat dreaming about her son. He found the box of letters she'd mentioned, dozens of them written to James over the months of her pregnancy. In them, Lisa had written about Michael, about their love story, about her hopes for James's future. She'd written about wanting him to be kind and strong, about wanting him to know that even though his parents weren't there, he had been loved from the moment he existed. Reading those letters, David understood the full weight of what Lisa had asked of him. She hadn't just wanted someone to take care of James's physical needs. She'd wanted someone to be his family, to love him unconditionally, to make sure he grew up knowing his story and feeling proud of where he came from. When David finally brought up the idea of fostering James to his wife Rachel, he was nervous about how she'd react. They had their own daughter, Katie, who was 8 years old. Taking in a baby, especially one with such a tragic story, would change their entire family. But Rachel surprised him. After he told her the whole story about Lisa's last words and the promise he'd made, she was quiet for a long time. "You know," she finally said, "I've been a nurse long enough to know that sometimes people come into our lives for a reason. Maybe this baby needs us, and maybe we need him too." They started the process of becoming foster parents immediately. It involved background checks, home visits, and lots of paperwork. But every day, David would visit James in the NICU, and every day the baby seemed to get a little stronger. Mrs. Williams from Social Services was cautiously optimistic about their application. "It's unusual," she admitted, "but given the circumstances and your medical backgrounds, I think this could work. The baby will need someone who understands his needs, and you both clearly care about his well-being." After 2 months in the NICU, James was finally strong enough to leave the hospital. David will never forget the moment they put James in his arms for the trip home. The baby looked up at him with those same dark eyes, and David whispered, "Your mama would be so proud of you, little man." Bringing James home was both the most wonderful and the most terrifying thing David had ever done. The baby was still so small, barely 6 pounds even after 2 months in the hospital. Rachel had prepared the spare bedroom with a crib, changing, table, and all the things they'd need, but nothing really prepares you for having a newborn in the house, especially one with such a heartbreaking story. The first few weeks were exhausting. James needed to be fed every 2 hours, and he had to take special medicine because his lungs were still developing. David and Rachel took turns getting up at night, but David often found himself just sitting by the crib, watching James sleep, and thinking about Lisa's final words. Their daughter Katie had mixed feelings about the new addition to their family. At first she was excited about having a baby brother, but she quickly realized that babies need a lot of attention. She'd been the center of her parents' world for 8 years, and suddenly there was this tiny person who seemed to need them all the time. "Why does he cry so much?" Katie asked one evening after James had been fussing for an hour straight. "He's still learning how to be in the world," Rachel explained patiently. "Remember, he was supposed to stay inside his mama's belly for 2 more months. Everything is new and scary for him." David was holding James, trying to calm him down when something magical happened. The baby looked up at him and stopped crying, just for a moment, as if he recognized David's voice. It was the same voice that had promised his mother that he would be loved and protected. "I think he knows you," Katie said, her annoyance forgotten for the moment. The really hard part wasn't taking care of James day to day. David and Rachel were both medical professionals, so they knew about feeding schedules and medicine and all the practical stuff. The hard part was dealing with the emotional weight of the situation. David would look at James and see Lisa's eyes, or the baby would make a face that reminded him of that night on the highway. Sometimes he'd wake up in the middle of the night, not because James was crying, but because he'd been dreaming about the accident again. Rachel was incredibly patient with David's struggles. She'd find him reading Lisa's letters to James, or looking through the photo albums they'd found in Lisa's apartment that showed her and Michael together, happy and in love. "You know it's okay to grieve for her," Rachel told him one night. "You only knew her for a few hours, but she trusted you with the most important thing in her life. That's a big responsibility to carry." The social workers visited regularly to check on how things were going. Mrs. Williams was pleased with James's progress and with how well he was fitting into the family, but she had to prepare them for the legal realities. "Fostering is supposed to be temporary," she explained during one of her visits. "The goal is usually to reunite children with their biological families when possible, but in James's case, there really isn't any family to speak of." David had been researching, though. He'd found information about Michael's military service and had tracked down his parents in Texas. Michael Torres Sr. and his wife Maria had been devastated to learn about their son's death, but they were overjoyed to discover they had a grandson. The first phone call with Michael's parents was emotional for everyone involved. David explained how he'd met Lisa, about her final wishes, and about James's first few months of life. Michael's father cried when David told him that Lisa had wanted James to know about his father's bravery and service. "We want to be part of his life," Maria said through tears. "We lost our son, but knowing that part of him lives on in this baby, it gives us hope." They arranged for Michael's parents to visit, and it was a meeting that changed everything for James's future. When they walked into David and Rachel's house and saw James for the first time, it was like watching a family heal right before your eyes. "He has Michael's eyes," Maria whispered, holding James for the first time. "And look at those little hands. Michael had the same long fingers." Michael Sr. was quieter, but David could see the emotion in his face as he looked at his grandson. "Lisa," he said finally, "tell me about her. Tell me about the woman who loved our son." David spent hours that weekend sharing everything he knew about Lisa, showing them her letters and photos, telling them about her dreams for James. In return, Michael's parents shared stories about their son, about his childhood, his dreams of being a soldier, and his plans to come home and start a family. It was Katie who came up with the idea that would shape James's future. She was sitting on the floor playing with James and listening to the adults talk about custody and legal arrangements and visitation schedules. "Why can't he just have lots of families?" she asked innocently. "I mean, he has us, and now he has grandparents in Texas, and he had a mama and daddy who loved him before he was born. Why does it have to be just one or the other?" The adults looked at each other, and David realized that his 8-year-old daughter had just solved the puzzle they'd all been struggling with. Over the next few months, they worked out an arrangement that felt right for everyone. David and Rachel would adopt James officially, giving him stability and a permanent home. But Michael's parents would be very involved grandparents, visiting several times a year and having James come stay with them in Texas during school breaks. When he was older, the legal process was complicated, but everyone involved wanted what was best for James. The judge who finalized the adoption was moved by the story and by the unusual family arrangement they'd created. "This child is lucky," the judge said during the final hearing. "He's lost his biological parents, which is a tragedy no child should have to face. But he's gained a family that chose him out of love, and grandparents who will make sure he knows where he comes from. That's not something every adopted child gets." The night after the adoption was finalized, David sat in James's room, watching him sleep in his crib. The baby was almost a year old now, healthy and happy, crawling around and starting to say his first words. "Your mama would be so proud," David whispered. "You're loved by so many people, little guy. And someday, when you're old enough to understand, we'll tell you the whole story about how brave she was and how much she wanted you to have a good life." 3 years had passed since that rainy night on the coastal highway, and James had grown into a curious, energetic toddler who filled their house with laughter. He had dark, curly hair like his father, and bright, intelligent eyes that reminded David of his mother every single day. James was walking now, running actually, and getting into everything with the fearless spirit of a typical 3-year-old. David often marveled at how normal their life had become. James was just another member of their family now, arguing with Katie over toys, helping Rachel in the kitchen by making more mess than help, and following David around the yard like a little shadow. But David never forgot the promise he'd made, and he knew the time was coming when James would start asking the questions that all adopted children eventually ask. The first real conversation came on a sunny Saturday morning when James was playing with his toy cars in the living room. Katie was showing him a photo album from a recent family vacation, and James pointed to a picture of the 5 of them together: David, Rachel, Katie, James, and his paternal grandparents who had visited from Texas. "Where's my first mama?" James asked innocently, the way only a 3-year-old can ask such a profound question. David and Rachel had been preparing for this moment for months. They'd read books about talking to adopted children about their origins, and they discussed with child psychologists about the best way to tell James his story without traumatizing him. David sat down on the floor next to James and pulled him onto his lap. "Your first mama's name was Lisa," he said gently. "She loved you very much, even before you were born." "Where is she now?" James asked, playing with the buttons on David's shirt. "She's in heaven now," David explained. "She got hurt in an accident, but before she went to heaven, she made sure you would be safe and loved. That's how you came to live with us." James seemed to accept this explanation with the matter-of-fact way that children process big concepts. "Did she know Daddy Michael too?" David smiled. They'd been telling James stories about his father since he was a baby, showing him pictures and sharing the stories that his grandparents had told them. "Yes, she loved your Daddy Michael very much, and they both loved you." As James got older, David began to share more details about that night and about Lisa's wishes for her son. He kept Lisa's letters safe, planning to give them to James when he was old enough to read and understand them fully. But for now, he shared the simple, beautiful parts of Lisa's story. Every year on the anniversary of the accident, David would visit Lisa's grave. For the first few years he went alone, but when James turned 4, David decided it was time to bring him along. The cemetery was peaceful, with tall trees and well-maintained paths. Lisa's headstone was simple but beautiful, with her name, dates, and the words "Beloved Mother" carved into the gray stone. David had chosen those words himself, because that's how Lisa had thought of herself in those final moments, as James's mother, willing to sacrifice everything for her child. "This is where your first mama rests," David explained to James, who was unusually quiet as he looked at the headstone. David knelt down next to the grave and helped James place the flowers they'd brought. "Lisa," David said softly, "I want you to know that James is doing great. He's smart and funny and kind, just like you wanted him to be. He knows about you and about Michael, and he knows how much you both loved him." James stood quietly for a moment, then surprised David by speaking directly to the headstone. "Hi, Mama Lisa. I'm big now. I can ride a bike and I know all my letters." David felt tears sting his eyes. Even at 4 years old, James seemed to understand that this place was special, that the woman buried here had played a crucial role in his life. The drive home from the cemetery was quiet, but when they pulled into their driveway, James perked up. "Daddy David," he said, "am I lucky because I have lots of people who love me?" "Yes, buddy," David said, his voice thick with emotion. "You're very lucky, and you make all of us lucky too." Over the years, David had kept in touch with some of the other people from that night. Dr. Rodriguez still worked at the hospital and always asked about James when David ran into her. The nurses from the NICU sent birthday cards every year. Even Mrs. Williams from social services had become like family, checking in regularly and marveling at how well James was thriving. David had also started volunteering with an organization that helped families affected by car accidents. He couldn't save every family like he'd tried to save Lisa, but he could use his experience to help others navigate the difficult times after trauma. One evening, when James was 5, he came to David with one of Lisa's letters that had fallen out of a box David was organizing. "What's this?" James asked, holding up the envelope with his name written in Lisa's careful handwriting. David's heart skipped a beat. He'd been planning to wait until James was older to share the letters, but maybe it was time. "That's a letter your first mama wrote to you before you were born," David explained. "She wrote lots of letters telling you how much she loved you and how excited she was to meet you. Can you read it to me?" David opened the letter carefully. It was one of the shorter ones, written when Lisa was about 6 months pregnant. In it, she wrote about feeling James kick for the first time, about choosing his name, and about her dreams for his future. "I hope you grow up to be kind and brave," David read aloud. "I hope you always remember that you are loved, and I hope you use that love to make the world a little bit better." James listened intently, his small hand resting on David's arm. When David finished reading, James was quiet for a long moment. "She sounds nice," James said finally. "She was," David replied. "She was very nice, and she would be so proud of the little boy you're becoming." That night, as David tucked James into bed, the little boy looked up at him with those serious dark eyes. "Daddy David," James said, "thank you for keeping your promise to Mama Lisa." David's breath caught in his throat. "How did you know about that?" "I just know," James said with the simple wisdom of a child. "You promised to take care of me, and you did." As David turned off the light and closed James's bedroom door, he realized that his promise to Lisa had been fulfilled in ways he never could have imagined that night on the highway. James wasn't just surviving, he was thriving, surrounded by love and knowing his story. He was growing up confident and secure, aware of where he came from and excited about where he was going. The promise had been kept, but more than that, it had created something beautiful. A family that chose each other, a child who knew he was wanted, and a love that would last a lifetime.